Well, in addition to everything you just heard, I have some pretty exciting news, and it's that today, as you didn't know, is the first day of fall. For those of us who are year-rounders here in Tucson, no disrespect and no shade to you snowbirds, but for those of us who are for those of us who are full-timers, you might think of summer as more surviving and fall and winter and early spring as really living, you know? And so with that, we thought this would be a great time to start a brand new series. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are back from your summer sojourning. And so here we are together. We're starting a brand new series. One thing I want to mention, too, is as we start this new series, we're also starting a 4-week group coinciding with this series. So basically, on Wednesday nights here in this room at 6 p.m., there's going to be a group called the Digest Group, and basically it's an opportunity to just further discuss the message in a smaller setting. So there's no need to sign up for that. All you got to do is show up here at 6 p.m. over the next 4 weeks. There's going to be a rotating group of leaders for that, and we invite you to that. And the last series that we had, if you remember, was called Reality Check. And the theme of that series, the topic of that series was reality. And if you're new here, you might be thinking, that's a little broad of a topic. Like that is so wide and expansive. How do you actually talk about reality? Like, what are you talking about? And so I thought that for this series, I just narrow it down, make it more concrete, make it a little less abstract. So I thought for this series, we'll do a series on life. And more specifically, what is a life that is actually vital and alive? What does a life worth living look like? Because how many of us know there's a difference between just being physically alive and actually living? How many of you have heard this phrase, I want to live before I die? You know, sometimes people ask me about Aldea. They say like, well, what is this place? And you know, for us to be a unique community with so many diverse spiritual experiences, paths, and traditions that can come together in one room, sometimes people don't necessarily have a concept for what that can be. So people often ask me, well, what is kind of the foundational teaching? Or people don't really know what to think of when they imagine a place that doesn't have a singular doctrine that grounds everything. And honestly, what I tell people is because we are so spiritually diverse, through our different paths, through our different traditions, through our different experiences, the common thing that I think we're all looking for is to live a full, meaningful life, right? To live from a place of values. Maybe that's one of the best definitions for spirituality that we could ever have. And so that is something that I want to pursue and really explore in this series. And this series is called ZOE. And you might be wondering, what is ZOE? And to explain and answer that question, we are going to be looking at the Greek language. And you might be thinking, Jake, what does Greek have to do with anything? And I would say it's not the fact that Greeks have the best fries, although they do, and I'm not going to be taking questions on that. But the reason that we're looking at ancient Greek today is because whether we realize it or not, so much of our Western worldview, so much of our English language is influenced and inspired by Greek. And beyond that, our spiritual vocabulary, whatever your background is, whatever tradition you grow up in, much of our spiritual vocabulary and the spiritual language we use is influenced by the Bible, influenced by the New Testament, which was written mainly in Greek. And so it's important for us just to understand how we see the world, whether we realize it or not, has a lot of ancient Greek influence. And you'll see in a second, because in Greek, there are 2 words for life. And one of these words is bios. Now, we can probably see how this has made its way into our language, right? Biology. And bios is really in reference to the physical aspect of life, right? We are here physically breathing, blood pumping. I am alive. But there is this other word for life in Greek, and that word is ZOE. And this is in reference to our spiritual life. Now, I want to acknowledge that in a room of this size, there are going to be many definitions of what we mean when we're talking about spiritual. And I welcome that variety, and I hope that as we go through this series, that you embrace your unique definition. So when you're thinking about ZOE as something deeper than just the physical, allow that to be whatever it means for you. But regardless, how many of us have had an experience, whether it was ourselves or another, where you could say, you know, I was alive, or this person, they were alive, but not really living, right? Blood pumping, air in the lungs, but maybe there's something missing. See, biology doesn't cover everything there is about life, right? You're not going to hear very much about love or loss in a biology textbook. And yet, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we might be physically dying or physically disadvantaged, right? Maybe our bios isn't working in every way that we'd want it to, and yet we may be full of a different quality of life. As many of you might know, we lost a dear member of our community very recently named Chuck Collins, and in the last kind of few months of his life, I had the opportunity to sit with him a few times, and you know, I had this really transcendent experience being with him, where I was encountering a man whose body, whose bios, was in a state of transition. Right? It wasn't working the way it did in his youth, and really he was transitioning into the next phase of his journey, so to speak. But his ZOE was so tangible, was so present. I could feel and connect with him spiritually in a way that transcended words. We didn't use many words. But though his bios might not have been what it once was, his ZOE was so vital and so alive. And in a lot of ways, this is what inspired this series for me, to recognize the difference between these different aspects of what it means to be alive. Maybe you've had a similar experience, right? But I think regardless, we all know that on some level there is a difference between what we might think of as our physical body and what we might call our spirit, however you would define that. The philosopher Kierkegaard says that the function of the bios is to be the condition for the ZOE, which we might think of as just philosophy speak for the bios allows for the ZOE. Think about it like this. The purpose of physical life, in many ways, is to create a foundation for spiritual life. Like we have breath in our lungs, blood pumping through our veins, our cells reproducing, all of these things, right, to allow us to think, to feel, to know ourselves, and to know others, right? So the physical makes way for the spiritual. And we probably have seen this, right? Like how many of us have felt that if our basic physical needs weren't met, there was no way we were going to think about engaging spiritually, right? Like there have been times where, you know, I've come up here and I've shared a message and I didn't really get the response from all of you that I was expecting. And then I found out later that we ran out of coffee. I get it. I have a friend who we have these wonderful, deep spiritual conversations. We'll go on hikes, and I'm just like, oh, I love exploring the philosophy and mystery of the cosmos with him. But then when it comes to lunchtime and he's getting hungry, the whole demeanor of everything changes. He's the kind of person where he needs to know exactly when lunch is happening. So we'll have this really deep spiritual conversation, and then all of a sudden tone will shift and he'll be like, hey, it's 12:30. Do we have a plan where we're gonna eat something? And I just see this totally different look in his eyes. Maybe you're that person. That's okay. We love you. And so I want to explore this concept of ZOE together. And one of the ways that I want to do that is looking at the words of Jesus who used this phrase, but I do want to just caveat for really everyone in the room, because we are a space of diverse traditions, right? This is not a place where we're really asking you to believe any specific things. We're asking you to buy into a particular doctrine or dogma. Really, when I reference the words of Jesus or another spiritual teacher, these are tools on the path. Take them or leave them. But I want to go to John 10, verse 10. And he says, in a verse that maybe you are familiar with, whether or not you grew up in this tradition, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Knowing that this passage was originally written in Greek, do you want to venture a guess at what kind of life is being referred to here? Which word? Yeah, there you go. That was an easy one. And so in this series called ZOE, we're just going to be asking that question: what is this life to the full? What constitutes a life worth living? And I encourage you throughout the next 4 weeks to really think about, what does ZOE mean to you? Does it mean a life of passion? Does it mean a life of presence? A life of peace? And so what I want to do is I want to start in the earlier part of any life, right? Something we all have in common, and that is birth. Because just as we are taking a different perspective on life today, that there are two forms of life, the physical and the spiritual, I want to imagine what that would look like for birth, that perhaps there is a physical birth and then there is a spiritual birth. Now, again, I'm gonna come back to some words of Jesus, and again, same caveat, right? Take it or leave it. But I want to really dig into a particular story, an encounter that Jesus had, and I want us to kind of translate and reimagine that in our own lives. See, Jesus is speaking with a religious leader, highly respected in his day, named Nicodemus. Jesus was Jewish, and Nicodemus was Jewish. The difference is that Jesus had come along and was speaking about things in a very different way, in a way that challenged the religious order of the day, okay? And I want to pull that into today's context, right? For a room of people who are maybe all on this exploratory journey, and all of us, or at least many of us, have been on a journey perhaps outside of the confines of a religious tradition that we once grew up in. Can you imagine what it would be like to have a conversation with someone who maybe saw things a little different, maybe saw things a little bit outside of the box, right? Who was introducing and talking about a framework that was perhaps new and exciting, but also scary, right? And you might imagine that some of these conversations are had in private, right? Because you don't even know if you can incorporate what you're hearing into your life. This is the situation that Nicodemus was in. And so he visits Jesus under the cover of night, right, in order to have this conversation. And this is what Jesus says. He says, "Take it from me, unless a person is born from above, it's not possible to see what I'm pointing to God's kingdom. How can anyone," said Nicodemus, "be born who has already been born and grown up? You can't re-enter your mother's womb and be born again. What are you saying with this born from above talk?" Now, we got to remember, Nicodemus comes from the ancient Near East, right, over 2,000 years ago. And so he didn't have like a medical degree, but he still had some things pretty accurate here. And this is what Jesus says. When you look at a baby, it's just that, a body you can look at and touch, right? Bios. But the person who takes shape within is formed by something you can't see and touch, the spirit, and becomes a living spirit. Now, really what I want us to hold on to today is the fact that perhaps what Jesus is alluding to is the difference between a physical birth and a spiritual birth. That maybe we not only come into this world, but we also come into ourselves, the full expression of who we are. That maybe we are born, and then through various experiences in our lives, we are born again. And perhaps for you, it's again and again and again and again. I want to move to this quote from social psychologist Eric Fromm. He says, "The whole life of the individual is nothing but the process of giving birth to oneself. Indeed, we should be fully born when we die, although it is the tragic fate of most individuals to die before they are born." And I really want to cling to this phrase, the process of giving birth to oneself. This will sort of be the crux of today's iteration of ZOE. That Fromm is suggesting that perhaps by the end of our lives, may we be fully born into who we are. In other words, birth is a lifelong process. Now, some of us might be in this room today and you might say, "Jake, it's a little late for me to think about being born," right? But I love what is being suggested here, that as long as we are alive, we are still coming into who we are. We are still birthing who we are. Because the reality is, friends, in some sense, we come into this world unfinished, right? Not only spiritually, but even physically, right? That human beings are born half-baked. It's in fact an evolutionary adaptation, because human beings have one of the greatest brain-to-body ratios of any mammal. And so what that means is that our brains are so large in comparison to our body that if our brains were fully developed when we exited the womb, we wouldn't make the journey, right? And so what happens is that human babies are born still in the middle of growth, which is why human infants are some of the most dependent of infants of anyone in the animal kingdom, right? We've all seen a National Geographic video of giraffes being born, right? They fall out of the womb and immediately they just start going on their way, doing their thing, right? It would be the equivalent of us, being born with some college credit, right? The same is true of our ZOE, right? Just as we can't be born with the full weight of our brain, I wonder if we also aren't born with the full weight of our souls, right? Because how many of us didn't discover our passion until later in life? How many of us didn't necessarily feel fully alive until after some great loss or great change or even a great disappointment, right? How many of us would say that even today I'm still birthing new things in my life? One of the benefits of living in this age where, with the internet, with streaming, we see all these different stories, right? So many people, we're exposed to just kind of all these different lives that we didn't know about before this modern age, right? And so we see all these different passions and these different things that people are involved in. And it can be really exciting to watch. Like, how many of you know of the phenomenon, like, is it cake or not, right? Like, is it a Rubik's Cube or is it cake? You've probably all seen some version of this. And the reality is, behind this amazing piece of art is someone who has devoted their life to being so good at making a cake. Like, I don't think I can make a cake look like a cake. You know what I mean? This person can make a cake look like something totally different, to the point where you have to be careful before you sit in a chair these days. You're like, is it cake? And so we have people who have this incredible passion, or this kind of passion extends into athletics, right? Like, I found this new sport. I can imagine it's going to be in the Olympics soon. It's not yet, and I don't know what the name is, so I call it soccer pong. And it's just incredible, right? And you're just thinking, gosh, how much did they practice this exact thing? It's so wonderful to watch. Go ahead, let's just watch for a sec. We want to finish the point, right? The idea here, friends, is that we can witness in other people what we might describe as passion, right? This is why we love the Olympics and things like that. And part of what we're seeing when we admire passion is we're seeing someone who, in their own journey, they said, I must do this thing, right? This thing is calling me, because there's a lot of sacrifice when you are devoting your life to something like that. And so we see that level of passion and we're drawn to it and we appreciate it. And I think it's Because we all feel that pull in some way or another in our lives towards something. As theologian Parker J. Palmer said, before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, I must listen to my life telling me who I am. Friends, I wonder about this mystical push and pull between who you think you should be and what life is asking you to become. Again, this push and pull between who you think you are and what life is actually birthing out of you. I've faced this tension in my own life. I grew up an indoor kid, didn't see a lot of sun, glasses, nerdy, just kind of inactive in a lot of ways. And all around me were these really cool guys who BMX'd and surfed and snowboarded, and I wanted to be like them. And I thought, man, I want to surf, I want to snowboard. And then as I grew up, I started to realize I don't want to surf or snowboard. I want to surf or snowboard. Do we understand the distinction here, right? I didn't care if I was any good, and I wasn't any good. I just wanted to be the kind of person that wanted to do those things because I thought that was cool. And yet, at a certain point, I just started to realize that's okay, that I don't like that. Don't pretend to be something you're not, right? I'm a 31-year-old who goes to bed at 9 p.m., and I have embraced that part of myself. It's not something I have in common with everyone my age. And I wonder, friends, if ZOE begins when we accept who we are and who we're becoming versus trying to control who we think we should be. Think about children for a second, right? We give birth to them. Not all of us. Some of us give birth to them. And then we have to realize that they then must give birth to themselves, which can be difficult, right? Because it's just a difficult process when we have to do it, let alone watching a child have to do it. And also sometimes who they become is different than what we imagine, right? And yet, as Jung says, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Perhaps the privilege of a lifetime is also to watch someone else become who they truly are, right? Perhaps that is one of the greatest purposes of life. And who you truly are is not who society says you are. It's not what your religion says you are. It's not even what your parents say you are. And in fact, it's not even always what you think you are. It's who you truly are. And you might say, well, that's kind of confusing. I don't know who I truly am, right? But maybe something that we can do is start by recognizing those other voices that tell us who we're supposed to be, right? We can recognize what society and culture has told me to be. We can recognize what my religion has told me to be. We can recognize what our parents projected onto us. We can even recognize who we so often fool ourselves into thinking we should be. And by recognizing those voices, we might be free to listen to the voice of who we truly are. See, friends, the process of birth, even in the physical sense, even in terms of bios, is a process of differentiation, because as a child is born, they separate from the mother, and then as life continues, they continue to become their own person, right? They separate from perhaps aspects of family, maybe even the friendships that they grew up with, right? And Jung called this the process of individuation. It's a process that in some way all humans are engaging in. And you might say, Jake, well, you know, sometimes we talk about separation as the problem, right? That to imagine ourselves as separate is really an illusion, right? Aren't we all one? And yes, at different levels and perspectives, you might say this, but at the same time, here we are as human beings in these bodies on what you might call the human trip. And part of this process and this journey is to see and experience the universe and this gift of life from various diverse, unique perspectives. And the only way for us to really live into our perspective is to experience ourselves as an individual. And when I think about my spiritual journey and this process that I consider my deconstruction, which was in many ways my kind of evolution and journey outside of the confines of the faith tradition that I came from, what I found was who I was becoming was starting to be at odds with what my religion wanted me to be. And I was given this choice. Do I change myself to fit my tradition, or do I free myself? And when I started to make that choice, it wasn't instantaneous. It was a journey. But when I began to walk down that path, I began to realize that I didn't have all the same values as this tradition. And when I finally became okay with that, it started to break the system down. How many of us have found that in the process of accepting who we truly are, it came at a cost? It broke down some dynamics in our life. It maybe changed some relationships. And yet, friends, I wonder what happens if we don't go on this journey, if we don't find the ZOE within. Perhaps we then live a half life, stuck somewhere between bios and ZOE. I'm reminded of these stories of courage for people who came out to their friends and their family and their community, people who fully embrace their LGBTQIA plus identity, because I see these stories of how individuals who, in order to embrace their ZOE, their full self, they needed to have the courage to risk changing some relationships, to risk changing some dynamics, right? To at times come up against tradition and culture. And that, I think, friends, is the type of courage that we need to do what Rumi says, you were born with wings, why prefer to crawl through life, right? We're meant to fly, right? But it takes that kind of courage. We're meant to shine our light, but it takes that kind of courage. We're meant to live our truth, but it takes that kind of courage. And I'm reminded of this wonderful movie that came out in 2020 called Soul. How many of us have seen this movie? Well, if you haven't, I'll try to explain a little bit to you. Basically, in the world, it's a Pixar movie, and it, if you've seen Inside Out, I kind of think Inside Out is to psychology what Soul is to spirituality. And in this movie, right, the premise is that every soul, every one of us has a spark. And some people have lost their spark, and those people are in some ways, they're sleepwalking through life. They're trapped in that, half-life between bios and ZOE. And really the premise is that for an individual to be born into a human body, right, one must find their spark. You're like, is this a religion or something? What is this? But in the story, you have the main character, Joe, who is a jazz musician, but to himself, he views himself as a failing jazz musician, and so he thinks that he is losing his spark. And through a turn of events, he interacts with an unborn soul named 22, who has yet to find their spark, therefore not having been born yet into a human body. And so they both go on this journey together where they're asking, what's my purpose? What's my passion so I can be born, so I can come fully alive? And they end up having this amazing discovery that their spark is not their purpose. It's not what is the meaning of your life. In fact, their spark was simply their ability to appreciate and enjoy the gift of life. I'll say that again because it's an important distinction. The spark is not who are you supposed to be, right? It's just what do you love about being here? And so I want to show a clip from this film. And in this clip, basically what has happened through the story thus far is that Joe has looked at his past and looked at his life and really seen all the ways that he's failed. And he has all these symbols of his failures in his pocket, right? And in this scene, he has this epiphany where he takes all these symbols and he reinterprets them and re-sees all these moments in his life, not as the ways that he didn't fulfill his destiny, not as the ways that he was a failure, but all the beauty of those little moments and the little experiences of joy all along the way. And so it's a bit of a montage, and I invite you as you're watching this to think about your own life, to think about your version of these little sweet moments of appreciating the gift of life, nothing necessarily grandiose, not having all the fame and fortune in the world. And so as we play this clip, I invite you to see yourself in this. As you think about your own life today, I wonder if you might ask yourself, is my spark how important I am in the world? Is my spark how much money I've made? Or is it those moments and those things that I'm doing and the people I'm with when I feel most alive, right? See, today you might be thinking, I don't know how to get to my ZOE. But perhaps when we stop asking what our purpose is, right? In other words, when we stop chasing who am I supposed to be, right? And instead you allow who you are to come through, right? What do I love about life? What makes life worth living? What are those special, sweet moments? Even if I need to see them in a new light. You know, there's that scene just a moment ago where he's eating that piece of pecan pie alone in a diner. And earlier in the film, he had viewed that memory in a negative light, focusing on how alone he was. And in this reimagination, he saw this private moment of joy, right? Your ZOE can be found in the littlest of moments, friends. So I just want to invite you right now just to take a second to picture for yourselves, what are those moments, right? Go back to that montage for a second and what it looks like for you. What is your spark? Where is your ZOE? Maybe it's something we find when we free ourselves from asking who we're supposed to be and we allow who we actually are to come through.